Hello? Yes, this is he. What? No, please! Where is my daughter?
The hardest lies are never told to deceive someone else. They're told to protect the people we love. On a freezing November evening in Cedar Falls, Iowa, 48-year-old Michael Lawson was driving home after another 12-hour shift repairing power lines. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, covering the empty streets in a thin blanket of white. Christmas lights had already started appearing on front porches, and families were settling down for dinner. Michael should have been thinking about home, about his wife, Emily, about his 16-year-old son, Ethan, who had promised to cook dinner for the first time. Instead, his phone rang. The caller ID simply read, "Ethan." Michael smiled as he answered. "Hey, buddy." There was no reply, only breathing. Fast. Panicked. Then, a trembling voice barely escaped through the phone. "Dad, I think someone's dead." The world seemed to stop. For several long seconds, Michael couldn't speak. The steady hum of his truck engine suddenly felt impossibly loud. Snowflakes drifted silently across the windshield as his heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Ethan," he whispered, struggling to keep his own fear from creeping into his voice. "Tell me exactly what happened." On the other end of the line, Ethan was crying so hard that his words broke apart between breaths. He explained that he had gone to an abandoned warehouse with 2 classmates after school. It was supposed to be nothing more than a dare. Teenagers exploring a place they had seen on social media. Inside the building, they found an older man lying on the concrete floor. There was blood. Too much blood. One of Ethan's friends panicked and ran. The other called emergency services before disappearing into the darkness. Ethan, he stayed, frozen, unable to move, unable to understand what he was looking at. "Dad," he whispered again. "I touched him. I tried to wake him up. My fingerprints are everywhere." Michael closed his eyes. He knew exactly what his son was thinking. A frightened 16-year-old doesn't understand forensic science. He doesn't understand crime scene contamination. He doesn't understand that trying to help someone isn't a crime. He only knows one thing. He's terrified. Michael pulled his truck onto the shoulder of the empty road. The snowfall grew heavier. His hands tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "Don't run. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming." 23 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the abandoned warehouse. Police officers had already sealed the entrance. Paramedics stood silently nearby. The man was dead. Detective Rachel Monroe noticed Michael arriving before anyone else did. He wasn't running. He wasn't shouting. He simply walked toward his son, who sat wrapped in a gray emergency blanket, shaking uncontrollably beside an ambulance. Without saying a single word, Michael embraced him. Ethan collapsed into his father's arms. "Dad, I swear, I didn't hurt him." Michael held him tighter. "I know." Those 2 words would become the most important promise he would ever make, and the most painful promise he would ever try to keep. As detectives began separating witnesses for questioning, Michael noticed something no one else seemed to see. Ethan wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of disappointing his father. That realization broke something inside Michael. Because he remembered being 16 himself. He remembered making stupid decisions. He remembered believing that one mistake could destroy an entire life. He looked across the crime scene. Yellow police tape fluttered gently in the cold wind. Camera flashes reflected against broken warehouse windows. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the night. And for reasons he could never fully explain, a single thought entered his mind. If anyone's life is going to be destroyed tonight, let it be mine. That thought would change everything. The interview room inside Cedar Falls Police Department wasn't intimidating because of what it looked like. It was intimidating because of how quiet it was. The walls were painted a dull shade of gray. A single clock ticked steadily above the door. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a cold glow across the metal table where Michael Lawson now sat alone. On the other side of the wall, his 16-year-old son was being questioned by another detective. Michael couldn't hear a single word. And somehow, that silence frightened him more than anything else. Every father imagines protecting his child from danger. No father imagines protecting his child from the justice system. Nearly 40 minutes earlier, Detective Rachel Monroe had explained what investigators already knew. The victim was identified as Richard Collins, a 58-year-old property developer. He had suffered a fatal blow to the back of his head sometime between 6:15 and 6:40 that evening. There were no eyewitnesses. No murder weapon had been recovered. The warehouse security cameras had stopped recording nearly 3 weeks earlier after repeated electrical failures. Everything depended on physical evidence. And unfortunately, physical evidence had already begun pointing toward Ethan. His fingerprints were found on the victim's jacket. His footprints appeared inside the dust-covered warehouse. His DNA had been recovered beneath the victim's fingernails. To experienced investigators, none of those discoveries automatically proved guilt. To a terrified 16-year-old, they sounded like a life sentence. Detective Monroe entered the room carrying a thin case file. She placed it gently onto the table before sitting across from Michael. Her voice remained calm, professional, respectful. "Mr. Lawson, your son insists he only tried to help the victim." Michael nodded immediately. "Because that's exactly what happened." The detective held his gaze for several seconds, then quietly replied, "I hope you're right. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't reassurance either. It was honesty. The kind investigators are trained to protect." For almost an hour, they reviewed the timeline. Michael explained where he had been throughout the evening. Time cards confirmed he had remained repairing power lines until nearly 6:30. GPS data from his company truck supported his statement. Co-workers confirmed seeing him leave the worksite alone. Everything matched. Everything made sense. At least, until the detective asked one unexpected question. "Has Ethan ever been inside that warehouse before tonight?" Michael hesitated, only briefly. But detectives notice hesitation, even the honest kind. I don't know." Detective Monroe made a small note inside her notebook. It seemed insignificant, just one sentence among dozens. Yet Michael couldn't stop staring at the pen moving across the page. Every written word suddenly felt permanent. Then the detective stood. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" The room became silent again. Michael looked toward the large mirror on the opposite wall. He knew someone was watching from behind the glass. Every movement, every expression, every breath. He lowered his head into his hands. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the weight inside his chest to escape. He wasn't crying because he believed Ethan was guilty. He was crying because he feared the system might not know the difference. Almost 15 minutes later, the door opened again. But this time, Detective Monroe wasn't alone. A younger investigator quietly handed her a folder before leaving without speaking. She opened it, read one page, then another. Her expression changed. "Mr. Lawson, your son's fingerprints weren't only found on the victim." She paused carefully. "They're also on a broken metal pipe recovered 6 feet away." The words struck Michael like a physical blow. He stared across the table, unable to speak, unable to think. He imagined Ethan picking something up in panic, trying to defend himself, trying to help, trying to understand. Any explanation seemed possible. Except one. Murder. At that exact moment, across the hallway, Ethan sat alone in another interview room. His hands still trembled. He replayed the evening over and over inside his mind. The abandoned warehouse, the broken windows, the smell of oil and rust, the man lying motionless on the concrete. Then, a memory surfaced, so brief, so ordinary, that he hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Just before entering the warehouse, he had heard another voice, someone arguing, a car door slamming, footsteps running. He remembered looking toward the parking lot, but seeing no one. He opened his mouth to tell the detective, then stopped, because he wasn't sure, and frightened people often mistake uncertainty for uselessness. That forgotten memory would remain buried for months. Back inside Michael's interview room, Detective Monroe quietly closed the file. "Mr. Lawson, we still don't know exactly what happened tonight. But if there's something either you or Ethan haven't told us, now is the time." Michael looked down at the table. He could almost picture his son sitting alone just a few meters away, scared, confused, certain that he had already ruined his family's life. And in that moment, Michael made the decision that would define everything that followed. He slowly raised his eyes, took a deep breath, and said the words that no father should ever have to say. "Detective, maybe you're questioning the wrong person." The room fell completely silent. Detective Monroe leaned forward. She wasn't expecting what came next. Neither was anyone else. The room suddenly felt smaller, not because anything had changed, but because every decision Michael Lawson made from that moment forward would shape the rest of his family's life. Detective Rachel Monroe remained silent. She had interviewed hundreds of suspects during her career. She understood that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. Across the table, Michael's tired eyes drifted toward the family photograph tucked inside his worn leather wallet. It had been taken 4 summers earlier beside a quiet lake in northern Iowa. Emily was laughing. Ethan had his fishing rod over one shoulder. Michael remembered that day with painful clarity because, for just a few hours, life had seemed beautifully ordinary. He wondered if those ordinary days were already gone forever. After nearly a minute of silence, he finally spoke. "Detective, my son didn't kill anyone. But if someone has to answer for what happened, then ask me your questions." Rachel Monroe frowned slightly. "Mr. Lawson, that's not how this works." Michael slowly nodded. "Maybe not, but he's 16. His whole life is still waiting for him. Mine isn't." Those words lingered inside the interview room like heavy smoke. Across the hallway, Ethan sat alone with Detective Brian Keller. His hands were still shaking. He hadn't stopped replaying the warehouse inside his mind. The broken windows, the freezing air, the metallic smell of blood, and something else, something that still refused to make sense. Just before he entered the warehouse, he remembered hearing someone shout. Not words, just anger. Then, a car accelerating away. He wanted to tell the detective. He really did. But fear has a cruel way of convincing innocent people that uncertainty will only make them look guilty. So he remained silent. And every second of silence quietly widened the distance between truth and what investigators believed had happened. Back inside Michael's interview room, Detective Monroe placed a digital recorder onto the table. The small red light blinked once, then stayed solid. "For the record, state your full name." Michael looked at the recorder. It suddenly seemed impossible that something so small could permanently change so many lives. "Michael James Lawson. Age 48. Occupation." He swallowed. "Electrical line technician." The detective continued. "Mr. Lawson, earlier you suggested we might be questioning the wrong person. What exactly did you mean?" Michael closed his eyes. He could almost hear Ethan crying somewhere beyond the concrete walls. He imagined his son sitting in prison. Graduation missed. Birthdays forgotten. His first job. His first apartment. Every dream replaced by a prison cell. Michael couldn't bear the thought. When he opened his eyes again, his decision had already been made. "I was there." Rachel Monroe looked up immediately. "At the warehouse?" Michael nodded. "Yes." The detective leaned forward. "You previously told us you drove directly from work." "That wasn't true." His voice remained calm, almost frighteningly calm. "I stopped at the warehouse first." The room fell silent. What Michael was saying wasn't supported by the evidence. His company GPS placed him miles away during the estimated time of death. His co-workers had already confirmed his location. His phone records told the same story. But grief, fear, and love don't always speak the language of logic. Sometimes they speak only the language of sacrifice. Rachel Monroe watched him carefully. Something didn't feel right. Experienced investigators develop instincts that cannot easily be explained. The confession sounded rehearsed, yet strangely incomplete. She decided to ask only one question. "Mr. Lawson, if you killed Richard Collins, tell me how it happened." Michael opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because he didn't know. He wasn't inventing details. He wasn't trying to fool detectives. He was simply trying to stand between his son and a future he believed would destroy him. After several painful seconds, he whispered, "I lost control. That's all I remember." It wasn't a confession built from facts. It was built from desperation. Hours later, the official paperwork described Michael Lawson as having voluntarily admitted responsibility for the homicide. News traveled quickly. By sunrise the following morning, local television stations carried the headline, "Father confesses to warehouse murder." Social media erupted. Thousands of strangers praised him for finally telling the truth. Others condemned him as a monster. Almost no one asked why an innocent father would confess to a crime that investigators themselves still couldn't fully explain. Because public opinion rarely waits for the complete story. It only waits for the first one. That afternoon, Detective Monroe walked alone through the abandoned warehouse one final time. Something continued bothering her. She stood near the place where Richard Collins had been found. The concrete floor was stained with dried blood. Evidence markers had already been removed. Most investigators would never return. But Rachel wasn't looking at the body. She was looking at the silence. Then, she noticed something almost invisible. Near the loading dock, half buried beneath broken glass and months of dust, lay a discarded prepaid mobile phone. It had never been collected, never photographed, never entered into evidence. She carefully slipped on fresh gloves, slowly picked it up, and stared at the cracked black screen. She had no way of knowing it yet, but inside that forgotten phone was a single voicemail, 32 seconds long, a recording that would eventually expose why Michael Lawson had confessed, and why the real killer had never wanted that phone to be found. Outside the warehouse, the flashing police lights had finally disappeared. The yellow crime scene tape moved gently in the freezing wind, making a soft snapping sound every few seconds. The reporters were gone. The detectives had returned to the station. Even the paramedics had packed away their equipment. For the first time that night, the abandoned building was completely silent. Detective Rachel Monroe stood alone beneath the broken loading dock, her flashlight sweeping slowly across the cracked concrete floor. Most investigators would have gone home hours ago, but something inside her refused to let the case rest. Not because Michael Lawson had confessed, but because his confession didn't feel like the truth. During 22 years as a homicide detective, Rachel had learned that guilty people usually wanted investigators to believe their stories. Michael Lawson seemed desperate for detectives not to ask questions. That difference stayed with her. She slowly walked toward the southeast corner of the warehouse where the victim had been discovered. The cold air smelled of rust, wet concrete, and old machine oil. Broken windows allowed moonlight to spill across the floor in long silver lines. Her flashlight stopped. Something reflected back. Not brightly, just enough to catch her attention. Rachel crouched carefully. Half hidden beneath shattered glass and months of dust lay a small black prepaid mobile phone. Its screen was cracked from corner to corner. The plastic casing was scratched beyond recognition. It looked worthless, almost invisible. The kind of object every investigator walks past when they already believe they've solved the case. Rachel carefully slipped on a fresh pair of latex gloves. She lifted the phone. It was heavier than she expected. As she turned it over, a small red notification light blinked once, then disappeared. Her heartbeat quickened. The battery wasn't completely dead. 2 hours later, inside the digital evidence laboratory, technician Olivia Chen connected the damaged phone to a forensic recovery system. The device barely responded. Several files had already been corrupted. The display flickered continuously. Olivia looked toward Rachel. "If we're lucky, we might recover a few deleted records." Rachel nodded silently. Neither woman expected very much. Most abandoned prepaid phones contained nothing useful. A few contacts, old text messages, random photographs. Nothing that solved homicide investigations. The recovery process began. Minutes passed. Then, the computer emitted a soft notification tone. One recoverable voicemail. Length, 32 seconds. Timestamp, 6:11 p.m. Exactly 9 minutes before emergency services received Ethan Lawson's call. Rachel leaned closer to the monitor. Olivia pressed play. At first, there was only heavy breathing, wind, footsteps. Then, 2 unfamiliar voices. The first sounded frightened. "You promised. You said nobody would get hurt." Another voice interrupted immediately. Lower, calm, almost emotionless. "You should have stayed out of it." A loud metallic crash echoed through the recording. Someone shouted. The phone fell to the floor. For nearly 5 terrifying seconds, nothing but muffled movement. Then, a final sentence. Quiet, cold, almost whispered. "Blame the kid." Silence. The voicemail ended. Neither woman spoke. Rachel replayed the recording. Again, and again. Every time she reached those final 3 words, a chill ran down her spine. Because Ethan Lawson hadn't become a suspect through hidden evidence. He had become a suspect. Exactly as someone intended. Rachel immediately compared the timestamp with the official investigative timeline. Emergency dispatch had received Ethan's phone call at 6:20 p.m. The recovered voicemail had been recorded at 6:11 p.m. That meant something investigators had never considered. The victim had still been alive. Someone else had been inside the warehouse. And someone had deliberately planned to leave Ethan at the center of the crime scene. Michael Lawson's confession had protected his son from the wrong danger. Because the real killer had already decided who should take the blame. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat alone inside her office with headphones covering her ears, listening to the same recording more than 40 times. Each replay revealed another tiny detail. A train horn, a barking dog somewhere outside, the faint beep of a reversing delivery truck. Ordinary sounds. Sounds most people would ignore. But homicide investigations are often solved. Not by dramatic discoveries. By ordinary details everyone else overlooks. Then, on the 43rd replay, Rachel suddenly froze. Very faintly, almost hidden beneath the wind. A church bell rang. She checked the city's church schedules. Only one church in Cedar Falls rang its bell automatically at exactly 6:15 p.m. every weekday evening. It stood less than 400 yards from the warehouse, meaning the phone hadn't merely recorded a conversation. It had recorded the final minutes before Richard Collins died. For the first time since the investigation began, Rachel wasn't trying to prove Michael Lawson guilty. She was trying to prove that someone else had been there, and somewhere beyond that forgotten voicemail, the truth was still waiting. By the time the investigation entered its 5th month, most people believed the story had already been written. The evening news no longer asked whether Michael Lawson had committed the murder. Instead, every headline focused on a different question. Why would a father sacrifice everything for his son? Television commentators called him a tragic hero. Some called him a manipulative liar. Others believed he deserved sympathy. Almost no one considered the possibility that the investigation itself had begun with the wrong assumption. Because once the public embraces a simple story, the truth often sounds far too complicated. Inside the county detention center, Michael had stopped watching the news altogether. Every morning followed the same routine. The steel doors opened before sunrise. Breakfast arrived without conversation. The hours passed slowly between legal meetings and long stretches of silence. Yet every evening, he took from his pocket a small folded photograph that prison officers had allowed him to keep. It showed Ethan at 12 years old, proudly holding a homemade model airplane they had built together over an entire summer. Michael smiled every time he looked at it, not because the memory made him happy, but because it reminded him why he had confessed. If his own life had to disappear so his son's could continue, he had already accepted the price. What Michael didn't know was that someone outside those prison walls was quietly dismantling the entire case against him. Detective Rachel Monroe hadn't spoken publicly about the recovered voicemail. Not even the prosecutor knew its full contents. Only 3 people had listened to the original recording. Rachel, Digital Forensic Examiner Olivia Chin, and Assistant District Attorney Daniel Pierce. When Pierce first heard the final words, "Blame the kid," he removed his glasses and stared silently across the conference room. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered. "Can we authenticate it?" Olivia nodded carefully. "The metadata is intact. The timestamp matches the phone's internal clock. There are no signs the recording has been edited." Rachel leaned forward. "If this recording is genuine, then Michael Lawson confessed to protecting someone who was already being framed." The room fell silent again. Because that possibility changed everything. The prosecution immediately ordered investigators to reopen the entire timeline. For the first time since Richard Collins' death, detectives stopped asking how Michael committed the murder. Instead, they began asking who had benefited from everyone believing he did. Financial investigators reviewed Collins' business records. Detectives subpoenaed old emails, property transactions, phone records, insurance documents. Thousands of pages filled conference room tables. For days, nothing stood out. Then, late one Friday evening, a junior financial analyst noticed something surprisingly ordinary. 3 weeks before the murder, Richard Collins had canceled a multi-million-dollar redevelopment contract. The cancellation had cost one construction company nearly $12 million. The company president's name was Gregory Haynes, a respected businessman. No criminal history, no obvious connection to Michael Lawson. But one detail immediately caught Rachel's attention. Gregory Haynes' company trucks frequently delivered equipment less than 2 blocks from the abandoned warehouse. Meanwhile, Ethan Lawson couldn't forgive himself. Even after his father repeatedly insisted he had done nothing wrong, the guilt refused to disappear. Every night, he replayed the warehouse inside his mind. The broken windows, the blood, the shouting, the voice. He kept asking himself the same impossible question. If I had called 911 1 minute earlier, would Dad still be free? Emily Lawson often found her son sitting alone in the garage long after midnight. Sometimes he held his father's old work gloves. Sometimes he simply stared into the darkness. One evening she quietly sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally Ethan whispered, "Mom, he thinks he saved me." Tears filled Emily's eyes. "No." She gently took her son's hand. "He loved you. There's a difference." Those words stayed with Ethan long after she walked back inside. For the first time, he realized something heartbreaking. His father had never expected to come home again. 2 days later, Rachel received another report from the forensic audio laboratory. Technicians had enhanced the recovered voicemail using advanced noise isolation software. Hidden beneath the background wind, a second sound had emerged. Not a voice, an engine. A distinctive diesel engine with an irregular belt squeal occurring every 7 seconds. Most people would never recognize it, but one veteran mechanic did. He immediately identified the sound as belonging to an older Haynes construction hydraulic service truck. Only 5 vehicles of that exact model remained in operation anywhere in eastern Iowa. Every one of them belonged to Gregory Haynes' company. Rachel slowly closed the report. She wasn't looking at coincidence anymore. She was looking at direction. That evening, she stood outside the detention center, watching the sun disappear behind layers of gray clouds. Inside, Michael Lawson believed his life was over. Inside another home, Ethan believed everything was his fault. And somewhere beyond the city limits, a man who thought he had committed the perfect crime had no idea that 32 forgotten seconds were about to destroy everything he had spent months trying to hide. For the first time since Richard Collins was found dead, the investigation wasn't moving toward Michael Lawson. It was moving away from him. And somewhere in Cedar Falls, a man who had slept peacefully for 5 months was about to discover that the past has an extraordinary way of returning when you believe it has already disappeared. Gregory Haynes arrived at his construction headquarters just after 7:30 on Monday morning. The building overlooked a busy industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Forklifts moved pallets across the loading yard while diesel trucks rumbled through the entrance gates. Employees greeted him politely as they always had. To everyone around him, Gregory looked exactly the same. Confident, successful, respected. He smiled at his staff, signed invoices, answered emails, held a planning meeting for a new commercial development. No one noticed that every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the office window, almost as if he expected someone to be watching. Because beneath the calm exterior, something had begun to change. The night before, he had received a phone call from an attorney. The police wanted access to several maintenance records involving company vehicles. No explanation, no accusations, just a request. It should have been routine. Instead, Gregory barely slept. At the Cedar Falls Police Department, Detective Rachel Monroe spread dozens of photographs across the conference table. Construction vehicles, fuel receipts, GPS logs, employee schedules, delivery records. At first glance, nothing connected them. But investigations are rarely solved by looking for obvious answers. They're solved by noticing quiet patterns. Rachel picked up one photograph. It showed an aging hydraulic service truck parked outside a warehouse almost 3 months before Richard Collins died. The truck looked ordinary, except for one detail: a faded company identification number. Truck H17. The same vehicle identified by forensic audio experts after enhancing the voicemail recording. Rachel looked toward Olivia Chin. "Can we place H17 anywhere near the warehouse on the night of the murder?" Olivia opened another file. Its GPS unit stopped transmitting 43 minutes before the estimated time of death. Rachel frowned. "Accident?" Olivia slowly shook her head. "No. Someone manually disconnected it." The room became silent. That wasn't mechanical failure. That was intent. Meanwhile, Michael Lawson sat inside the detention center library, pretending to read an old paperback novel. He hadn't turned a single page in almost 20 minutes. His thoughts weren't inside the book. They were at home. He imagined Ethan trying to finish high school while classmates whispered behind his back. He imagined Emily paying legal bills she couldn't afford. He imagined birthdays he would never celebrate with his family. Yet strangely, he felt no regret, because every father understands something the world often forgets. Love isn't measured by what you're willing to give. It's measured by what you're willing to lose. Michael had already decided that losing everything was acceptable, as long as Ethan never had to. He still believed his sacrifice had worked. He had no idea. The truth was already beginning to reach him. Across town, Ethan hadn't returned to the warehouse. He couldn't. Every passing train, every flashing ambulance, every abandoned building reminded him of that night. Sleep came only in fragments. Some mornings he woke convinced he could still smell cold concrete and rust. Other mornings, he heard his father's voice. "Don't run. I'm coming." Those words echoed through his memory over and over. Not because they frightened him, because they reminded him that his father had arrived without asking whether the danger was real. He simply came. That's what fathers do. And somehow, that realization hurt even more. Late that afternoon, Rachel Monroe and two investigators quietly drove into the industrial park. They didn't arrive with flashing lights. They didn't want headlines. Not yet. Gregory Haynes welcomed them into his office with practiced confidence. "Detective, how can I help?" Rachel smiled politely. "We're reviewing vehicle maintenance records, particularly for truck H-17. For the briefest moment, less than a second, Gregory's smile disappeared. Most people would never have noticed. Rachel did, because fear rarely announces itself. It flickers, then hides. Gregory handed over several maintenance binders. Rachel casually turned the pages. Oil changes, brake inspections, hydraulic repairs. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Almost. Too organized. Then she reached one page that had clearly been replaced. The paper was newer, the ink darker, the hole punches cleaner than every surrounding document. Rachel looked up. This page was rewritten. Gregory laughed softly. Probably just copied after coffee spilled on it. A harmless explanation. Completely reasonable. Except, the original maintenance invoice still existed in the company's digital archive. And according to that archive, truck H-17 hadn't been serviced that week at all. It had been assigned to an emergency delivery near the abandoned warehouse at 6:02 p.m., 18 minutes before Ethan Lawson called 911. Rachel slowly closed the binder. She didn't accuse Gregory. She didn't raise her voice. She simply thanked him for his cooperation, then quietly walked toward the door. As she reached the hallway, she stopped. Without turning around, she asked one final question. "Mr. Haynes, have you ever met Richard Collins?" Silence. Just 2 seconds. But sometimes, 2 seconds reveal more than 2 hours of questioning. "No." Rachel nodded. "Interesting." She opened the office door. "Because your phone records show you called him 6 times during the week before he died." She stepped into the hallway, leaving Gregory standing alone. His face had turned pale. His breathing had changed. And for the first time since Richard Collins' murder, the man who believed he had buried the truth forever realized someone was digging. The trial began almost 11 months after the night that changed the Lawson family forever. By then, the story had already spread far beyond Cedar Falls. National television networks called it "The Father Who Confessed." Newspapers described Michael Lawson as either the most devoted father America had ever seen, or the most convincing liar investigators had ever questioned. Millions of people believed they already knew the truth. Very few realized the most important piece of evidence had never been played inside a courtroom. Not yet. On the first morning of the trial, the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras long before sunrise. Satellite trucks lined both sides of the street. Reporters rehearsed their opening lines while photographers waited behind metal barricades. Inside, Michael Lawson stood quietly beside his attorney, Sarah Whitaker. The navy blue suit he wore had become noticeably loose after nearly a year in county detention. His hair had turned grayer. His shoulders seemed heavier. But his eyes never searched for the cameras. They searched only for one face. Ethan. When their eyes finally met across the courtroom, neither smiled, neither waved. They simply looked at one another. Sometimes, love doesn't need words. It only needs to know the other person is still there. The prosecution began exactly as everyone expected. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Pierce carefully walked the jury through Michael's recorded confession. Every sentence echoed through the courtroom speakers. "I was there. Ask me your questions. I lost control." Several jurors quietly took notes. The confession sounded genuine. It sounded voluntary. It sounded devastating. Then the prosecutor looked toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, people do not confess to murder unless they are responsible for it. The words hung heavily in the courtroom. From the gallery, Emily Lawson closed her eyes. She had heard those same recordings dozens of times. Each time, they heard exactly the same. When the prosecution rested its case, Sarah Whitaker stood. She carried no dramatic charts, no oversized photographs, only a single laptop. She calmly connected it to the courtroom's evidence system. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to introduce newly authenticated digital evidence. The judge nodded. Proceed. Sarah looked briefly toward Michael, then toward the jury. For months, everyone has listened to one confession. Today, you're going to hear the conversation that happened before it. The courtroom became silent. The lights dimmed. The recovered voicemail appeared on the courtroom screen. 32 seconds. No photographs. No narration. Only sound. At first, the jurors heard nothing but wind. Footsteps. Heavy breathing. Someone shifting nervously. Then, the first frightened voice. You promised. You said nobody would get hurt. Several jurors instinctively leaned forward. Then came the second voice. Calm. Cold. Unfamiliar. You should have stayed out of it. A loud crash echoed through the speakers. Someone screamed. The recording distorted. Then, the final sentence. So quiet, yet so unforgettable. Blame the kid. Silence. The recording ended. No one moved. Even the reporters stopped typing. The courtroom felt as though the air itself had disappeared. Sarah allowed the silence to remain. Then she asked only one question. Members of the jury, does that sound like a murder plan by Michael Lawson? Or a murder plan for someone else to take the blame? No dramatic performance. No raised voice. Only a question. Sometimes, questions carry more power than answers. The prosecution immediately challenged the recording. Forensic experts were called. Digital analysts testified. Audio engineers explained waveform authentication, metadata verification, signal degradation, compression artifacts. Every independent specialist reached the same conclusion. The recording had not been altered. It had been created exactly when investigators claimed. 9 minutes before Ethan Lawson called 911. For the first time since Michael confessed, the jury wasn't questioning whether he had lied. They were questioning why he had lied. And that changed everything. The following afternoon, Detective Rachel Monroe took the witness stand. She spoke calmly, without emotion, without accusation. She admitted something almost unheard of in a murder trial. Our investigation became focused on proving Michael Lawson's confession. Instead of testing whether it was true, the courtroom fell silent. She continued. When the voicemail was recovered, we realized we had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. Not, did Michael confess? But, why would an innocent father confess? Then came the final witness. Gregory Haynes. He entered the courtroom, wearing the same confident suit he had worn for months. But confidence can disappear very quickly. Sarah Whitaker approached him slowly. She placed a stack of phone records before him. Then photographs. Then GPS data. Finally, the maintenance records for truck H-17. Mr. Haynes, would you explain why your vehicle's GPS stopped transmitting exactly 43 minutes before the murder? Gregory swallowed. Equipment failure. Sarah nodded. Interesting. She displayed the maintenance inspection completed 2 days later. According to your own mechanic, the GPS unit had been manually disconnected. Silence. The confidence in Gregory's face began to disappear. One answer led to another. One contradiction uncovered the next. By the end of cross-examination, the man who had walked into court looking untouchable could barely look at the jury, and Michael Lawson, for the first time in 11 months, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally catching up with the lie. For almost a year, Michael Lawson had carried a burden that was never his to bear. Every sunrise inside a concrete prison cell reminded him of the same promise he had made on that freezing November night. If anyone's life is destroyed, let it be mine. He never imagined that promise would one day bring him back into the same courtroom, not as a convicted murderer, but as a father waiting to discover whether the truth still mattered. The final day of the trial arrived beneath heavy gray skies. Rain fell softly against the courthouse windows, turning the city outside into a blur of silver and shadow. Inside courtroom 3, no one spoke louder than necessary. Even the reporters seemed quieter than usual. They all understood that some verdicts decide more than guilt or innocence. Some verdicts decide whether people can still believe in justice itself. Michael sat beside Sarah Whitaker with both hands folded tightly together. His wedding ring had become loose after months in detention. He slowly turned it around his finger again and again. The same nervous habit Emily had watched him do since the day they married. Across the courtroom, Ethan couldn't stop looking at his father. Every line on Michael's face, every gray hair, every wrinkle beneath his tired eyes, felt like something he had caused. The guilt had followed him every single day, not because he believed he was responsible for Richard Collins' death, but because he believed his father had sacrificed everything to save him. And some burdens children should never have to carry. Before closing arguments began, the prosecution made an unexpected announcement. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Pierce rose slowly. His voice carried none of the confidence the jury had heard during opening statements. Your Honor, the state wishes to recall one witness. The courtroom turned toward the rear entrance. 2 federal marshals escorted Gregory Haynes into the room. He looked nothing like the confident businessman who had testified days earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled. Dark circles surrounded exhausted eyes. His hands trembled noticeably as he approached the witness stand. He refused to look toward the Lawson family. After taking the oath, Gregory remained silent. For almost 30 seconds, the judge finally asked, "Mr. Haynes, do you understand that you remain under oath?" Gregory nodded. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Yes." Another silence followed. Then, he spoke words no one inside the courtroom expected. "Michael Lawson never killed Richard Collins." The gallery erupted. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. The judge immediately struck the gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Gregory lowered his head. Tears rolled silently onto the witness stand. He confessed, because he loved his son. "I stayed silent, because I loved my money more." For the next hour, the truth unfolded piece by piece. Richard Collins had planned to expose fraudulent construction contracts worth millions of dollars. Gregory believed those documents would destroy everything he had spent years building. The confrontation inside the warehouse was never supposed to become violent. But arguments fueled by greed often become tragedies without warning. Richard fell, struck the concrete floor. Panicked, Gregory grabbed the prepaid phone that had recorded part of the argument. He believed he had destroyed it. He never realized the voicemail had already been saved automatically by the mobile network. When he saw frightened teenagers approaching the warehouse, an idea formed almost instantly. Blame the kid. 3 words spoken in panic. 3 words that nearly destroyed 2 innocent lives. The courtroom remained silent. Not because people were shocked, but because many were ashamed. Ashamed that they had judged Michael before hearing the whole story. Ashamed that headlines had replaced evidence. Ashamed that a father's love had been mistaken for guilt. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. When they returned, every person inside the courtroom stood. The foreperson unfolded the verdict. Regarding Michael James Lawson, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty. Michael closed his eyes. A single tear rolled slowly down his face. Not from happiness, from relief. The kind of relief that comes only after carrying unbearable weight for far too long. Emily covered her mouth as she cried openly. Ethan ran toward his father before the deputies had even finished removing the restraints. Michael embraced him so tightly that neither wanted to let go. For nearly a minute, the courtroom disappeared around them. There were no cameras, no reporters, no judge, only a father, holding the son he had been willing to lose everything to protect. Several weeks later, Gregory Haynes formally pleaded guilty to charges including manslaughter, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to frame an innocent person. The court sentenced him to decades in prison. Detective Rachel Monroe declined every television interview offered to her. When asked why, she simply answered, "Justice shouldn't be about becoming famous. It should be about correcting our mistakes." Michael Lawson never returned to repairing power lines. Instead, he accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that supported families affected by wrongful convictions. He spent years speaking quietly with parents sitting outside courtrooms, waiting for verdicts they couldn't control. He never gave speeches. He never sought attention. He simply listened, because he understood something few people ever do. Sometimes, the greatest act of kindness is allowing another person to believe they are no longer alone. Years later, Ethan graduated from law school. On the morning he was sworn in as an attorney, he carried the same faded family photograph his father had kept inside his prison cell. After the ceremony, he placed his arm around Michael's shoulder. "Dad, everything I've become started with what you were willing to lose for me." Michael smiled gently, then quietly replied, "No, it started the day you chose to tell the truth. Never forget, the truth may arrive late, but when people refuse to stop searching, it still finds its way home. Some stories end with justice, others end with forgiveness. This one ended with both, because a father's greatest sacrifice was never the false confession he signed. It was the silent decision he made to carry a burden that belonged to someone else. And perhaps that is why the strongest people are so often mistaken for the guilty. Not because they have something to hide, but because they have someone they are trying to protect.